You've probably complained about the cold this week. Maybe you turned up the heating. Maybe you threw on an extra blanket. And if it got really bad, maybe you ordered a new coat online while sitting in your warm house drinking something hot. Now go back 40,000 years. The temperature outside is 40 degrees Celsius. There is no Amazon. There is no thermostat. There is no house, at least not the way you understand it. Just you, a landscape that wants you dead, and the strangest collection of survival techniques humans have ever invented. Your ancestors didn't just survive the Ice Age. They did things so creative, so bizarre, so genuinely unhinged that when archaeologists first discovered the evidence, they genuinely thought it had to be wrong. This is not the story you learned in school. And by the end, you're going to look at cold weather completely differently. Let's start with what cold at 40 degrees Celsius actually means. This is the temperature where Celsius and Fahrenheit meet, where the two scales agree on just how catastrophically hostile the environment has become. At this temperature, your exhaled breath doesn't just fog, it crackles. Moisture freezes midair. Exposed skin can develop frostbite in under 10 minutes. Your body, designed by evolution for African savannas, begins shutting down non-essential systems to protect your core. A modern human, even one wearing decent winter clothing, would struggle to survive a night at 40 degrees Celsius without shelter. And yet, across Eurasia, from France to Siberia, Ice Age humans not only survived winters like this, they raised children through them, created art during them, and apparently had enough spare time to invent some of the most ingenious and flat-out weird warming strategies in human history. Here's the first thing archaeologists got completely wrong about your Ice Age ancestors. They assumed warmth was the primary goal. It wasn't. The real goal was moisture control, and the lengths they went to achieve it read like experimental engineering. At Pavlov in the Czech Republic, 29,000 years ago, researchers discovered something that stopped them cold. Literally. Inside a winter dwelling, they found the remains of what appeared to be a woven floor. Not animal hides, not dirt. A deliberately constructed platform made from thousands of plant fibers, raised about 15 centimeters off the ground. Why would anyone spend weeks weaving a floor? Because your ancestors understood something modern campers learned the hard way. Ground cold is the killer. The earth sucks heat from your body faster than air ever could. That woven floor created an air gap, and that gap meant the difference between sleep and hypothermic death. It's the exact same principle as a modern camping mat, invented 29,000 years before REI existed. But the floor is just the beginning. The really wild part was what they put on top of it. Chemical analysis of residue found on these floors shows repeated applications of fat, likely from mammoths or reindeer, rubbed into the fibers. This wasn't food storage. The distribution was too even, too deliberate. They were waterproofing the floor from below while making it shed moisture from above. Every time someone walked on that floor with wet feet, the fat coating caused the water to bead and run off rather than soak in. This wasn't primitive survival. This was materials engineering. Now here's where it gets genuinely strange. At multiple sites across what is now Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists found something that didn't make sense for years. Inside winter shelters mixed with hearth remains and tool debris, they kept finding thousands of tiny, deliberately shattered pieces of bone. Not food waste, not tool-making debris. Just bone, broken into fragments no bigger than your thumb, piled in specific areas. The first researchers assumed it was trash. Then someone actually tested the burn properties. Bone, when properly dried and broken into small pieces, burns slowly and produces intense, consistent heat with minimal smoke. Unlike wood, which flares hot then cools, bone releases energy gradually. Those tiny fragments weren't garbage. They were custom-engineered, slow-release fuel pellets. Your ancestors were pre-processing their heating fuel for optimal thermal output. They were making ancient briquettes. And it gets weirder. Analysis of these bone fragments shows they weren't random. Specific bones were selected, femurs mostly, because of their high marrow content. Even after the marrow was eaten, the porous interior structure of these bones meant they absorbed and released heat differently than solid bones. Someone, 25,000 years ago, understood combustion physics well enough to select fuel based on internal bone structure. Let that sit for a second. At Sungir, a site near Moscow dating to about 34,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered something that changed how we think about Ice Age clothing. They found a burial, an adult male, covered in thousands of ivory beads. Interesting, but not unusual. Except when they analyzed the bead placement, they realized something extraordinary. The beads weren't random decoration. They traced the outline of a complete garment, including seams. By mapping their positions, researchers could reconstruct the exact cut and design of the clothing this person had been buried in. And the design was sophisticated in ways that made no sense for the time period. The garment had tailored sleeves with fitted wrists. It had a hood integrated into the body of the coat, not attached separately. Most importantly, it had a continuous front opening with an overlap closure, meaning it could be sealed completely against wind, but opened quickly for temperature regulation. This is a parka. Not a rough approximation. An actual, purpose-designed parka with features you'd find in modern Arctic clothing. The person wearing it was buried 34,000 years ago. Experimental archaeologists tried to recreate this garment using only tools available at the time. It required over 300 hours of work. The stitching alone involved making thousands of precise holes through hide, using bone awls, then threading sinew through each hole. The person buried at Sungir was wearing what might have been a year's worth of specialized labor. If you're still here, hit subscribe. This gets wilder. Clothing and fuel were just the support systems. The real madness happened with shelter design, and this is where Ice Age humans stopped making sense entirely. At Mezhyrich in Ukraine, 15,000 years ago, builders constructed a house that used 95 mammoth skulls and hundreds of other bones. You've probably seen reconstructions. What you haven't heard is how they were assembled, because when modern engineers tried to replicate the design, they discovered something that seemed impossible. The bones weren't just stacked. They were weight-balanced in a structure that distributed load through geometric tension. Large skulls at the base, jaws interlocked for lateral stability, then layers of progressively smaller bones, each one positioned to transfer weight downward and outward. The whole thing was self-supporting without any binding or mortar. Modern engineers call this a tensegrity structure. NASA uses the same principle for deployable space structures because it's incredibly strong for minimal weight. Someone in Ukraine 15,000 years ago, using mammoth bones and zero math, built a tensegrity dome. The interior was even stranger. Hearth placement in these structures shows an understanding of convection that genuinely baffles thermal engineers. The main fire wasn't in the center where you'd expect. It was offset to one side, positioned so rising heat would curve along the dome's interior surface before descending on the opposite side, creating a circulation loop. This turns the entire structure into a convection heater, the same principle as a modern forced air furnace, but using bone architecture instead of ductwork. But none of this explains the truly baffling discoveries. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because some Ice Age warming strategies were so extreme, so visceral, that they get left out of museum displays. At sites across France and Spain, researchers found evidence of a practice so odd it was dismissed as misinterpretation for years. Inside some winter shelters, they found repeated, heavy deposits of human and animal urine, deliberately applied to specific sections of the walls. Why would anyone do that? Because urine, when it breaks down, produces urea, and urea in enclosed spaces produces ammonia. Ammonia is toxic, yes, but it also raises ambient temperature through its exothermic decomposition. In small, controlled amounts, in well-ventilated spaces, it creates a slight but measurable warming effect. They were using biochemistry as a heating supplement. Even stranger, chemical analysis suggests this wasn't random. The concentrations were controlled. Someone understood there was a threshold between slightly warmer and everyone dies from ammonia poisoning, and they managed it successfully for generations. This implies a level of experimental knowledge that's genuinely disturbing to think about. How many people died learning that threshold? Who was the first person to notice that the corner everyone pissed in was slightly warmer? And what kind of mind makes the leap to weaponizing that? At La Marche in France 14,000 years ago, archaeologists found something even more extreme. Stone slabs with carved images, which is normal for the period. But these slabs were found deliberately positioned around hearths in a specific configuration, close to the fire but angled outward. They were radiant heat reflectors. Someone understood that flat stone surfaces near fire don't just get warm, they reflect infrared radiation. By angling stones correctly, they could redirect heat toward living areas. It's the same principle as a modern heat reflector for camping, but carved with images of horses and bison, because apparently even your heating system needed to be art. And then there's the most uncomfortable discovery of all, documented at multiple sites but rarely discussed in popular archaeology: deliberate burns on children's skin. At Kostenki in Russia, skeletal remains of children show unusual scarring patterns on their extremities, particularly hands and feet. These aren't accidental burns. They're controlled, repeated, and located in areas most vulnerable to frostbite. The burns are shallow, superficial. The current theory makes grim sense. Controlled burning to deliberately scar and thicken skin in areas most likely to suffer cold injury. It's horrifying, and it might have saved lives. Scar tissue is less sensitive and more resistant to environmental damage than normal skin. This is prophylactic mutilation in the service of survival, and children were subjected to it systematically. Let's sit with that for a moment. Let's acknowledge what it means. Your ancestors loved their children enough to hurt them, to save them. The Ice Age wasn't an adventure. It was a meat grinder that demanded innovations so desperate we're uncomfortable even discussing them today. But there was beauty too, tucked between the horror. At Dolní Věstečník, also in the Czech Republic, archaeologists found something unexpected inside a winter shelter, a kiln. Not for pottery, though they made that too. This kiln was specifically designed to heat stones to precise temperatures, around 200 to 300 degrees Celsius, then carefully transport them using hide wraps into sleeping areas. They were making bed warmers. Someone, 26,000 years ago, loved someone else enough to heat stones by a fire, wrap them carefully so they wouldn't burn, and tuck them into sleeping furs so their person could sleep warm. That's not survival instinct, that's tenderness. The same site yielded carved figurines, the famous Venus of Dolní Věstečník among them. Chemical analysis of the clay shows these weren't made in summer. They were made in winter, by firelight, during the long months of confinement. Art wasn't a luxury they permitted themselves after survival was secured. Art was apparently what kept them human when everything else was trying to kill them. Recent isotope analysis of Ice Age remains has revealed something even more profound about how communities survived. Individuals who were elderly, injured, or disabled show survival into ages that would have been impossible without intensive care. Healed fractures that required months of immobilization. Tooth loss so complete, they must have been eating pre-chewed food. Someone was keeping these people warm, feeding them, maintaining their body heat when they couldn't contribute to their own survival. The most important Ice Age warming technology wasn't woven floors or bone fuel or even mammoth-bone architecture. It was each other. Groups that stayed together, that shared body heat, that took turns maintaining fires through the night, that passed knowledge about which bones burned best and how to angle heat reflectors. Those groups survived. The ones that didn't. We found the mammoth-bone houses and the clever hearths and the tailored parkas because communities built them together and used them together and passed them to children who passed them forward. Modern Arctic survival training still teaches the buddy system as the first principle of cold weather survival. Not gear, not skills, other humans. We learned that 40,000 years ago, and we're still learning it. When the Ice Age ended about 11,700 years ago, most of this knowledge vanished within a few generations. Not because it was lost, but because it wasn't needed anymore. Forests grew, temperatures stabilized. The bone fuel pellets and urine walls and controlled burns became unnecessary, and then they became forgotten. Modern archaeologists had to rediscover it, fragment by fragment, and piece together a story so strange we initially refused to believe it. Go back to that thermostat you touched this week. The number on it represents a miracle your ancestors achieved through methods so creative, so desperate, so occasionally horrifying that we sanitize them for museum displays. They didn't conquer the cold through strength. They survived it through ingenuity, community, and a willingness to try absolutely anything that might work, including things that absolutely shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The next time you're cold, really cold, and you reach for heat without thinking, remember what it actually took. Remember the person who first wove a floor. Remember the parent who burned their child's hands to save their fingers. Remember the builder who stacked 95 mammoth skulls into impossible geometry. Remember that warmth, for most of human history, wasn't a setting on a dial. It was the hardest thing we ever achieved, and we did it together, or we didn't do it at all. That's not ancient history. That's us. That's what we're capable of when the alternative is freezing in the dark.